Hi, Matt Saintsing here, and today we're going to talk about a famous battle that took place more than 30 years ago now. A battle that includes elite soldiers like Army Rangers and other Army Special Operations units, Navy SEALs, Air Force pararescuemen, and of course, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. These are quiet professionals who go around the globe owning the night to accomplish their mission for you, myself, and every other American. And that part of military service is rightfully unsung. I mean, there's a reason they call them quiet professionals after all. However, today's episode is not about one of those battles that no one's heard about. The Battle of Mogadishu took place in October 1993. It left 18 Americans dead and 73 wounded. It was the bloodiest day for U.S. troops in combat since the Vietnam War, and led to 2 Medals of Honor, which were the first since the Vietnam War. Now, of course, this battle was captured in the book Black Hawk Down, which was amazing, by the way. Anyone should read it. And today's interview is with that author, Mark Bowden. Now, Mark is not a veteran himself, but for anyone who's read the book, and you absolutely should, it's an excellent exposition on urban combat. He has deeply reported on this epic battle that took place in Somalia more than 30 years ago. DAV covered this battle in the September-October edition of DAV magazine, but for non-members, you can catch it online by going to DAV.org or just simply Google DAV and Black Hawk Down. I promise you'll find it. I don't want to waste any more time. Here's author Mark Bowden on Black Hawk Down.
First, I want to ask, when you wrote Black Hawk Down, did you know the wild success the book and movie were going to have?
No, absolutely not. I knew it was a great story, and I thought it was an important story, and so I was thrilled to be doing it. But there was no suspicion that this would become a big commercial project or a movie was so far outside my, realm of expectations or thinking. It would never even occur to me. And, and I can tell you partly why. Every major publisher in New York turned down my proposal to write that book.
Really?
So I not only had, I had, no expectation that the book would become a big success. It was just something that I really wanted to do. And that was why I ended up writing it for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I convinced the newspaper to support me in writing what I knew would ultimately be a book. But in the past, when I'd written a book, and I'd written 2 previous ones, I'd gotten a contract from a publisher, and I was able to take a leave of absence from the newspaper to write and report. And in this case, since I couldn't get a contract, I talked the newspaper into supporting me. So under those circumstances, I had absolutely no expectation.
How did you first hear about the Battle of Mogadishu, and what motivated you to write this story?
Well, like everybody else, I saw the terrible pictures on TV of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets by angry mobs in Mogadishu.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, because I had long been interested in the idea of writing about a battle, I went out and read everything I could find, all of which then convinced me that I wanted to do something more.
And, the book is definitely, I would say, a intense exploration of modern warfare and especially of urban combat. With the movie, I know you were, a part of the movie. How true to the story did the movie make it? I know there's always some concessions that have to be made.
Absolutely. I think it was as true as we could make it. I remember sitting down with Chad Oman and Mike Stenson, 2 of the executive producers, right when we first started planning the film. And we all got out yellow legal pads and started to list all of the scenes from the book that we thought absolutely had to be in the movie.
Mm.
And pretty soon the list was so long, we realized, well, there's no way that. And I remember saying, well, why don't we make a 4-hour movie? And Jerry Bruckheimer said to me, Mark, do you know why movies are 2 hours long? And I said, no, I don't really know why. He said, because if it's a 3-hour movie, they can only show it twice a day at the movie theater. If it's a 2-hour movie, they can show it like 4 times during the day.
Yeah.
So if we make a 3-hour plus movie, we cut our potential profits in half before we're ever even out of the gate. So we're not doing that.
Gotcha.
So, but every, film is a different medium, and you are always making choices and compromises. And I think ultimately what the movie does is tell the story in a different way. But I think that it captured kind of the spirit of the book, and it also did a pretty good job of adhering to the facts in the book.
And I have read that some of the stunts included soldiers from the actual units. I think the 160th and maybe some other special operations units. Is that true?
It is true.
Wow.
Yep. In fact, when I arrived on the set in Morocco, it was the same day that the units from the 160th and the Ranger Regiment got there. So it was, in some cases, people I had met, in many cases, people who were sort of excited to meet me, because at that point the book had been out for a while and had been a big hit, and they were kind of curious to meet the author.
The story of the Battle of Mogadishu, I was really trying to, I'm trying to figure out when this all started, the path for Task Force Ranger. And I mean, I don't know if this is going too far back, but the Socialist Revolution in 1969 really seemed to be starting off the first domino of a series of dominoes that led to civil war and famine.
That's pretty much my understanding. I do know that there was a dictator who ruled there for a pretty long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really only the collapse of that regime that led to all of the infighting, all of the civil war that led to the famine and U.S. and UN involvement.
So I want to fast forward a little bit to 1992. Somalia by now is described as a failed state. It's again civil war, famine, and this UN mission, UNISOM, which stood up not by President George W. Bush, but he certainly contributed American troops to that mission.
President George H.W. Bush sent in 20,000 Marines, and the problem was getting the food that was being delivered by the UN to Somalia to the people who were starving.
Yeah.
And the various factions were tying up the food at the ports and refusing to allow it to be distributed in the country, which is what it was basically deliberately starving out the population. So the Marines, they kind of famously landed on the beach with CNN cameras filming them coming up. But, and a lot of fun was made of that. But in fact, the Marines did a hell of a job. They opened up the food delivery, and the famine was ended. I think the UN ultimately estimated that as many as 800,000 lives were saved.
Wow. Okay. What was the impetus then for Task Force Ranger?
The answer to your question is that when the situation had stabilized in terms of the famine, the UN realized, and the bulk of the troops there at that point were American.
Yeah.
There were Pakistanis and others, but the Americans were the backbone of that mission. And the feeling was that if they withdrew, because the famine was over, that conditions would just revert back to what it was. That the fighting would begin again, the famine would start up again, they'd have to come back. So the idea was, let's get these factions together, see if we can't get them to cooperate to form some kind of civil government so that we can leave with the hopes that there'll be some stability here and we won't have to come back right away. So that was what UNISOM undertook. In early 1993, the UN was working to build this cooperative government, and Mohammed Farah Aidid's faction, which was the largest and the most powerful, was not only refusing to cooperate, it had begun attacking the UN peacekeeping forces. So you mentioned the Pakistani incident where scores of Pakistani soldiers were killed. It had become a real problem. And so then, the decision was made in Washington to basically remove Mohammed Farah Aidid from the equation. Let's get rid of Aidid, and then the UN will be able to establish a coalition. And so Task Force Ranger's job was separate from the UN mission.
Yes, yeah.
Was to go in there and target Aidid's organization and basically dismantle it. So they were in the process. They had done, I think, 6 missions.
Yes.
Of rounding up, various high-ranking individuals in Aidid's organization And ultimately, they were going to grab ID. But that was what Task Force Ranger's mission was.
The idea of sending a couple hundred of, the United States military can bring a lot of firepower when it wants to, right? And the idea of sending 400 elite soldiers to hunt one person, that sounds like it's something after 2001.
Matt, that it wasn't just going after him. He had a fairly extensive organization. He was a general.
Right.
He had, his whole clan behind him. And so, just eliminating him wouldn't necessarily have eliminated the problem.
Yeah.
But I think the idea was to take apart his organization.
I want to talk a little bit about October 3rd, 1993. Of course, the day that the 15-hour battle started. I know it was a time-sensitive target. And from what I can gather, the mission is a success and is going relatively smoothly right up until PFC Todd Blackburn falls some 60 feet and he's critically injured. And in your mind, how did that impact the greater mission?
The biggest factor, I think, is that it slowed them down.
Yeah.
I think the essence of the kind of snatch and grab mission that they undertook was to get in and get out fast. And one of the things that they had learned in their previous missions was that the timeline was actually decreasing, that the Somali clan fighters were getting better at responding rapidly when the team hit the ground. So they knew they had a limited amount of time, and things were clicking along pretty well. But then when Blackburn fell, that required, getting him evacuated. Yeah. And it wasn't a crippling blow to the mission,
right?
But it did slow it down. And it turns out that became a critical event.
20 minutes after Blackburn fell, the main targets of the mission were captured. Then Super 6-1 is downed. A downed helicopter kind of shifts. A kill and capture mission changes to a rescue mission real quick.
But my point about the timeline kept getting smaller and smaller because the response time of the Somali fighters was getting smaller. Yeah. So we mentioned just the little bit of slowdown caused by Blackburn. Now suddenly you've got a Black Hawk down and you've got a team that needs to be rescued.
Yeah.
Now at that point, you are in an increasing maelstrom. And so it's important to try to get to the down crew at Super 6-1, but the idea of getting in and out rapidly went out the window at that point.
Yeah, the famous quote, of course, is "We just lost the initiative" from General Garrison, which that is an actual real quote that was said for sure. So, of course, Super 6-4 begins circling the sky, and not long after that, an RPG is hit, and Super 6-4 lands, about a mile away from the target building, which they might as well have been on Mars as far as the time it took to go through the city with, thousands of rebels and barricades. What can you tell me a little bit about Randy Schuckardt and Gary Gordon's desire to be inserted into the second crash site?
Well, obviously tremendously heroic. I think they were convinced that they could do it.
Yeah.
They had every expectation that a convoy would be coming from the base to reinforce them. And so the idea was to save Durant and anybody else alive in that bird and hold off the mob long enough for the rescue convoy to fight its way in and take everybody out.
Yeah,
I think that's what was on their mind, and there was a decision about it because I think back at the where the commanders were, they had a better idea of the problem of getting a convoy to that location. And so on the one hand, you've got commanders who don't want to put Schuckardt and Gordon in a impossible situation. And on the other hand, you've got them saying, look, we can do this, and it's urgent. We see them moving down there. We need to get down there. So they made that call, and Schuckardt and Gordon paid for it with their lives.
I believe these were the first Medal of Honors to be awarded since Vietnam War. How did the battle end? They had wounded, but they could not get to them all night long. There's a famous scene of running out of the city into this. The 10th Mountain got involved. It seems like a chaotic scene to how this battle ended.
Yeah, I mean, you had the bulk at that point later in the day of Task Force Ranger was hunkered down and around the first crash site, and they were being given air support by Little Birds, so they were doing a good job of defending themselves. But there were a lot of people trying to kill them. I've heard that Garrison, some of the other commanders believed that Task Force Ranger could have fought itself back to the base on its own. But I don't think anybody makes the argument that that could have happened without a lot of casualties.
Yeah.
But so instead, they hunkered down and they waited for the UN, the 10th Mountain Division, and Pakistani forces and others, I think, to put together a very large, well-armed convoy to rescue Task Force Ranger. So that's, the latter part of the book is the 10th Mountain Division fighting its way into the city. And then, because some miscalculation on the scene, there wasn't enough room in the armored vehicles for the Rangers who were trapped around the first crash site. So they ran out of the city with the convoy, and then at one point became detached from the convoy. And so that's that sort of harrowing mile that they ran at the end, where they were no longer even being protected by the convoy; they were just running, to get out of the city.
Yeah, I think one thing Larry Perino told me was, he's like, when he got into the UN vehicle, he's like, I don't even think my feet touched the ground the entire time. Like, everyone was just packed in there, jammed. So I guess all these years later, in your mind, what should we make of the battle? What can this tell us about, the nature of warfare or service?
Well, I do think that if you're probably too young to remember this, but when this happened, there was a really unrealistic arrogance about, I don't think it's true necessarily within the military itself, but just in the general public, that our military was so sophisticated, so well trained, so much more advanced than any in the world, that we could send our men and women out on a mission like the one to Somalia and accomplish it really without anybody getting hurt.
Yeah.
That it was more a matter of willingness to do it. Sure, there's a risk involved, but our guys are so good. People just felt, okay, we own this. We can do whatever we want. And I think this was a real wake-up call that even Somalia, which has no real army and certainly not, sophisticated equipment and well-trained soldiers and even a well-defined organization, could do real damage to a small American force. So I think that came as a shock. It certainly came as a shock to President Clinton, who apparently had never anticipated that something like this could happen.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the big lessons that was learned. Of course, the military itself learned all kinds of lessons, in part just because this was the first really sustained firefight that our forces had been engaged in. And anytime you make contact like that with the enemy, you learn all kinds of lessons about tactics and methods, and even how effective was body armor, and the simple things like Delta Force operators wearing hockey helmets instead of reinforced helmets that will protect their heads from shrapnel or bullets. So all those lessons came out of it as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and it is an example of the military will say yes to any mission that civilian leaders ask of, and they'll try to accomplish it, but it comes with risks.
Without a doubt. But I will say that the soldiers who were involved in this, certainly the Delta Force operators, they understood the risks.
Yeah,
they knew when they went in there that they were risking their lives and that people could get hurt. So they were far more savvy about what was going on. It wasn't like they were being led like innocents to the slaughter. They had volunteered to do this kind of work, and they knew what they were getting into.
What about this AC-130 Spectre gunship that never really makes it to the show? But, when I'm talking to the operators, a few of them said that every time they practiced this stuff, they had it in their package. And then when it came time to go to the show, that, deploy, that it was taken from them. And, I guess a soldier on the ground is going to want as much firepower as possible. But again, the AC-130 gunship in a city of millions, in a situation like this, you could have had a lot of civilian casualties.
Yeah, without a doubt. And there were other factors as well. I mean, I think they were trying to move Task Force Ranger into Mogadishu a little bit on the down low. They didn't want to draw a lot of attention to what they were doing, and those big gunships come with big crews, and they're very large planes. It would have enlarged the footprint. It would have made it a lot more visible what they were doing. But the other thing to consider too is that Garrison, who was the commander, later testified that he was always of the opinion that sufficient air cover for the kind of mission that they were going to do was there with the Blackhawks and the Little Birds.
Okay.
And he really did. He believed that they were actually better suited for that kind of urban setting and combat than the AC-130, which sits way up high and, as you know, an area the width of I-95 through the city where nothing lives or breathes.
Right.
I mean, they could have just carved a path. So there's no doubt that the AC-130 could have, helped, but it would, as you say, have been catastrophe in terms of human life.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark. You've been very generous with your time. I really do appreciate it. My last question here is, what do you want the lasting legacy of Black Hawk Down to be?
Well, I think that it ought to make people understand, in the way that every good book about war does, is the nature of combat. And that it is never a thing to be entered upon lightly. And that heroic notions of defeating the enemy and triumphing good over evil are all well and good, but when the shooting starts, it's chaos.
Yeah.
And death is random, injury is random. It's a perfect nightmare of a situation. So, I hope that when people read that story, they realize the incredible courage and real nobility of those who are willing to do these kind of missions, but that they also understand the moral and ethical obligations of a government to use that kind of force wisely.
Yeah, once the shooting starts, everything goes out the window, and reasons why you're there don't matter. And the part death being random, I think it absolutely is. Like, those of us that deploy realize that it doesn't matter if you're the best or worst soldier, is a bullet or a bomb is indiscriminate. And I think it was that understanding that, wow, it doesn't matter how good I am. If it's my time, it's my time. And that, for me personally, was just extremely frightening. But,
of course it is, and it would be for anybody. If you realize that there's nothing you can do, you're in this situation. You can pray.
Yeah.
And you can try to do what you've been trained to do, because that will be the only thing you can do to try to keep yourself safe. But as you say, the very, very best people, sometimes their number comes up, and so it is a horrible situation to be in. No one should ever be eager to enter into that.
Absolutely.
But sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's all for today's episode. You can read more about the Battle of Mogadishu again on DAV.org. And you can also follow along with all of our other excellent coverage found on the website. Thanks for listening. Until next time.